my last video, I showed you how to make yogurt from scratch, and a byproduct of that is liquid whey, and I kind of mentioned how you could use that to make dough and various types of things. So in today's video, I'm going to show you how I use the liquid whey to make pizza. Let's get started. Go ahead and get the dry ingredients ready so that we can pour in our liquid ingredients. And this recipe I got from a website I'll link down in the comments. It's a copycat pizza dough recipe from my family's favorite pizza chain, which is called Mellow Mushroom. And I'm using some wheat flour as part of it only because I have a lot of it and I need to get rid of it. So this is just a personal preference. So in the recipe, she calls for 3 to 3.5 cups of flour. However, I live in such a humid climate that I find I always have to use a little bit more. So I use 3.5 cups minimum and then see how the dough feels and then go from there. So that was 1 cup. I know some people are a little bit more, well, I should say a little bit less careful about their measurements, but when it comes to flour and baking, I try to be very precise. So now we need 4 teaspoons of active yeast. And 4 teaspoons gluten flour. And our last thing is 2 teaspoons of salt. And I give it a little mix with the whisk. And then I'm making a little space for the liquid to go in. If you'll remember in my last video, I poured off the liquid whey that we strained out of the yogurt and put it in a jar, and I keep it refrigerated until I'm getting ready to use it. And essentially, the liquid in a dough recipe can be substituted for the liquid whey. And in this case today we're making pizza, but you could use this in any dough and it will complement the flavor, and also you're adding protein to it as well. So in this recipe, it is 1.5 cups of liquid. You also can tell from the condensation on the glass that this is cold. Obviously, it's been in the refrigerator, but to make yeast dough, you have to have warm water. So I'm gonna microwave this for about 1.5 minutes to get to the temperature we need to jumpstart the yeast. Okay, and this is exactly at the right temperature. So we're gonna go ahead and add in our olive oil and molasses. And a tip that the author of this recipe calls out is if you use your tablespoon to measure the olive oil first, 1 tablespoon, when you add in the molasses, it will slide right off the spoon. And we need 2.5 tablespoons of molasses. There we go. You see, it slides right out there. And I'm just gonna eyeball the 1/2 tablespoon. Okay. Stir it up really well. There we go. sure it's locked. And we're gonna use the paddle attachment to do the initial mixing, which I use a KitchenAid mixer because I have it, but obviously you could knead this by hand, absolutely. We're just gonna we're gonna bring the ingredients together. Okay. And then I'm gonna switch to the dough hook to do the kneading. And I'm going to turn this on speed 2, and it's going to knead for 7 minutes. About halfway through, I check the dough to see that it's wet or dry enough, and this is very wet, so it's going to rain today, so I think it's a little bit too humid. So I'm going to add a little bit more flour. You can see how it's kind of running off the hook. It's not going to come together very well. So add about 1/4 cup more flour and turn it back on. Okay, so it's been about 7 minutes and it's still a tiny bit sticky, but this is the good sticky where it doesn't really come off on your hands when you touch it. So we need to prepare our bowl where the dough will rise. In a large mixing bowl, you're gonna take a little bit of olive oil, maybe like a tablespoon. And spread it all around so the dough won't stick to the sides of the bowl. And you can do this while the dough is mixing. I just didn't want that sound in the background while I was filming. Okay. My hands. Okay. I did use a little bit of flour to scoop this out of the bowl, but we're gonna form it into a nice little ball. Put it down in the olive oil that settled at the bottom and then flip it over. And now we're gonna cover it with wrap. And cover it with a towel. I'm gonna show you a tip that I got from a friend for proofing and rising the dough. When I first started trying to bake bread from scratch, I always struggled with getting the dough to rise correctly, and I narrowed it down to the fact that my house is just too cold. So one of my friends gave me a tip to actually proof it in the microwave with a container of hot water. So while the dough is mixing, I put a 5-cup container of water into the microwave and microwave it for 3 minutes to get it nice and hot. And then I'm gonna stick the bowl of dough in there with that hot water to let it rise, and that hot water helps retain the heat and keeps the area nice and moist as well. And ever since then, I've had so much more success baking, and I wish someone had told me that when I first started. So I'm gonna show you that right now. So no, you can't really tell, but this is hot water that I microwaved while the dough was mixing. And I'm gonna take my mixing bowl that we've prepared and stick it right in there. And the only downside to this is that you can't use your microwave for the time that the dough is rising. But we're gonna let this rise for 2 hours. While the dough is rising, I thought I'd take a few minutes just to chat about spiritual things. Something I always mean to talk about in these videos, and it's always in the back of my mind, and I just haven't found a way to really clearly articulate it in each video is how Cauldron & Craft came to be and what that really means to me. I would consider myself a feminist, and I always sort of rejected domestic things. I wasn't raised in a house where we cooked lots of things from scratch and baked. I'll take that back. My mom did bake a fair amount, like birthday cakes and things like that. I know my grandparents had a garden when I was first born, but by the time I was old enough to remember, they didn't have a garden anymore. I know my grandparents came from extreme poverty, and they had gardens out of necessity. They had to grow things and in order to feed themselves. And I kind of grew up as a city girl in the sense that I wasn't as connected to nature and the land. And it was probably around the time my son was born that I started wanting to be connected to that again. And literally as soon as my son was born, I went to live in an area that was a little bit more nature-y. It was a developed subdivision, but it was in the middle of nowhere, so like we could hear coyotes and things at night. And when I would take my dog for walks, just by myself, just the two of us out in the woods, and I could just feel the energy of the land and the trees. And not to go off on another tangent, but when I was much younger, when I was a kid, I did feel very drawn to, I'm gonna say the occult only because there's no other word to say it, but then I kind of outgrew that, thinking that it was just kid stuff. And so it's taken the last 9 years to let myself get back to those things. And I promise I'm going somewhere with this story and how it relates back to cooking and growing things. So, especially over the last 2 years, since COVID lockdowns and being able to be home more and having to cook out of necessity because restaurants were closed, so we started cooking a lot more. And it really made me feel connected to my ancestors and the culture that I know my ancestors came from, which was Ireland. And even though I've sort of grappled with the domesticness, so I'm doing very feminine things that women typically do: cooking, gardening, crafting. And I've kind of come to accept that I'm not doing this because a man told me to. I'm doing this because it makes me feel connected to my ancestors and spirituality. And when I posted it on Instagram this is months ago, about making yogurt from scratch and then having strawberries from my garden that I could put in there, and how that makes me feel connected also to the earth and to the land. When it comes to making things like that from scratch, like yogurt and yeast bread, you're working with living organisms, and that is the essence to me of magic and of spirituality. Yes, I'm making something that I'm going to eat, and I'm saving money for my family, and it tastes delicious, but at the most basic level, you're working with living organisms in a symbiotic way, and the science of that is also really interesting and exciting for me. So I wanted to kind of give a background of how, even though I work in IT, I work in a corporate job, and at work I'm very driven and goal-oriented and direct and tough. In this space, I get to be connected to something that makes me feel deeply spiritual and connected to the earth, while I'm also feeding my family and providing for my family. So that's just a little bit more about me and things that I think about in terms of crafting. So that's all about cooking, but in terms of crafting, it's also creating things with my hands. And that also makes me feel very connected, because even though my immediate ancestors, grandparents, great-grandparents, also crafted a lot, and that actually probably was the first thing that really made me feel connected, to them was making things, because my mom would always say, oh, you're just like your great granny, you can make anything. You could, when I had my tonsils taken out when I was 8, someone gave me a pot holder making kit, and I made like 20 pot holders because I just enjoy making these with my hands. It's very meditative for me. I started knitting after my son was born, so a lot of this actually happened after I became a mother, because a lot of times when women, you know, become mothers, they lose themselves a little bit, and so crafting is how I hold on to myself and gets me through stressful times. So I will get back to making pizza now, but I wanted to just share that little bit, and I'm going to do a better job hopefully in the future of talking more about that in the process of what am I thinking, what am I feeling as I'm making things, whether it's food, whether it's clothes, anything, and how that connects me to whether it's a Sabbath for the wheel of the year or an ancestor's birthday, things like that. I'm going to do a better job of that in the future. It's been 2 hours and we are going to punch down the dough, which it already deflated a little bit. I already peeked at it, and when I set it down it deflated. So rolling this back into a ball. Move the dough over to a cutting board. And this is going to be 2 pizzas, so I'm going to cut it right in half. Roll each half into a ball. And now they're gonna rise for 30 more minutes. I'm gonna reuse the wrap that I had earlier on the bowl so they don't get dried out in their final rise. I realized that I didn't have any pizza sauce, so bonus, I get to show you my recipe for pizza sauce. I used 2 15-ounce cans of tomato sauce and 1 12-ounce can of paste. A lot of times paste comes in a smaller can, but back in 2020 I was making so much pizza that I settled on this bulk way of making it that allows me to have batches for future pizzas, and as you can see it makes quite a lot. So basically I just whisk together the sauce and the paste to get it into the right consistency. Once it's at the right consistency, you want to add your seasonings, which I basically just wing it and keep tasting it until I like it. So I'm adding 3 tablespoons of sugar. You probably only need 2, and that cuts the acidity of the tomatoes. Then I'm adding a little bit of garlic powder, black pepper, oregano, onion powder, and anise seed. And then I'll just stir it up until I taste it. And this is after many stirs and tastes, but basically just keep adding those spices until you like it. And then the way that I store it is putting 2 cups into a Ziploc bag, and that is how much I use for 2 pizzas, so 1 cup per pizza. And as you can see, I got 4 bags, so that's 8 cups. And you'll see why I store it like this a little bit later on in the video. I'll use 1 bag for the pizza today, and then the rest of the bags I put in the freezer so I can just grab it next time we are making pizza. All right, it's been 30 minutes, and as you can see, the dough balls have about doubled in size, and now we're ready to roll them out. I'm going to use yellow cornmeal. And I just take the balls and flatten them out. And then we're gonna roll them to our desired thickness, which I like pretty thin pizza, so this is gonna be pretty thin. You want to try to keep it circle shaped if possible. If your pizza pans are circular, then they should probably stay in a circle shape. Now I'm going to use a bit of parchment on the dough so I can roll it up and put it on my pizza pan. Now you're probably thinking, why is this dough so much bigger than the pan? Well, we're gonna make stuffed crust pizza. Now you just fold the dough edges over the cheese and press it down. Making sure that it's pressed down really well. Now I'm going to brush the crust with this garlic spread. You could use just plain olive oil or make your own garlic spread. This is just something we like. Now I'm going to brush the inside of the crust with olive oil. Just a light brushing. And the garlic that I minced earlier, I'm going to sprinkle in the center. And this is why I don't put as much garlic powder in the sauce, because I know we're going to use fresh garlic on the pizza. And the reason I store the sauce in bags like this is because it makes it really easy to dispense onto the pizza once it's time. So I'm gonna cut off this corner, and now I can squeeze out the amount that I need for the pizza. And since we're doing 2 pizzas, half goes on one pizza, half goes on the other pizza. And this is just we like a really saucy pizza, so this is a lot of sauce. But obviously it's your preference. That's the beautiful thing about cooking from scratch, is you can cook it to the way you like it. We most often make pepperoni pizza, but we've experimented with chicken and bacon, mushrooms. It's just easy as pepperoni. It lasts a long time. So one bag stays in the fridge until we use it. And we had a pizza party, so to speak, with my stepson. I think it was back in 2020 when we first started making pizza. And instead of cutting the dough ball into 2 pieces to make 2 pizzas, I cut it into 4. So we had 4 mini pizzas, and each person got to make their own pizza exactly how they wanted. So for the crust, we like to do a cheddar cheese or like a cheddar jack inside the crust. And obviously we just did mozzarella on the top. And then on top of the pepperoni, I like to do a light sprinkling of Parmesan. I just like that saltiness on top of the pepperoni. And I preheated the oven to 450 while the dough was on its second rise. It's the perfect time to let, so it's nice and hot when you're ready to put the pizza in the oven. And so now it's gonna go in the oven for 11 minutes, and we're gonna check on it. And sometimes it needs an extra minute, and we'll just see where we're at. And while that first pizza's in the oven is the perfect time to make your second pizza, so it's ready to go in the oven as soon as the first one comes out. And I finished making the second pizza when the first one still had more than 2 minutes left in the oven. Just to give you an idea of how fast it goes once the dough is risen. So 11 minutes turned out to be perfect, and the second pizza's in the oven, everything's clean, and now we can eat. Spiritual connection when making pizza, but I challenge you to find magic in the everyday and find those little connections every day, because those little things add up and make you feel connected to something much bigger. Thank you so much for watching. I would love to know in the comments if you have tried this recipe, what's your favorite dough recipe, and if you're going to try to use some liquid whey next time you make it. And I hope to see you next time. Bye.